The gunshot that killed Zachary Matthews hadn't just stolen a husband. It had carved out Zelda's heart and left her hollow. She stood at the window of her modest house on the edge of Pahrump, Nevada, watching the autumn wind scatter dust devils across the main street, her hand pressed against the glass as if she could somehow reach through it and touch the past. 3 months had passed since the bank robbery that had taken him. 3 months since she had become the object of pitying glances and hushed conversations. 3 months since her world had shattered into pieces so small she doubted they could ever be reassembled. The morning sun cast long shadows across the floorboards, and Zelda forced herself to move away from the window. She had bread to bake for the general store, her only source of income now that Zachary was gone. The money he had saved was dwindling faster than she cared to admit, and the reality of her situation pressed down on her shoulders like a physical weight. She tied her dark hair back with a faded ribbon and moved to the kitchen, her movements mechanical, practiced, empty of the joy that had once filled even the simplest tasks. The knock at the door came just as she was measuring flour into a bowl. Zelda wiped her hands on her apron and answered it to find Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house. Her round face creased with concern that felt more obligatory than genuine. "Good morning, dear," the older woman said, her voice dripping with the kind of sympathy that had begun to grate on Zelda's nerves. "I was just checking to see if you needed anything. The ladies from the church have been talking, and we want to make sure you are managing all right." Zelda forced a smile that felt like cracking plaster. "I am fine, Mrs. Henderson. Thank you for asking. It is just that, well, a woman alone in these times, it is not proper, is it? Have you given any thought to what you might do? Perhaps you have family back east." The presumption in the question made Zelda's jaw tighten. "I am managing, Mrs. Henderson. I appreciate your concern, but I have work to do." She closed the door before the woman could respond, leaning against it as her false composure crumbled. The truth was that she had no family, no one to turn to, and the isolation was suffocating her. Zachary had been her everything, her partner, her best friend, her reason for waking each morning. Without him, she felt adrift in a vast and uncaring world. The bread dough came together under her hands, but she barely noticed what she was doing. Her mind was trapped in the past, replaying the morning Zachary had kissed her goodbye before heading to the bank to deposit the money from selling their horses. She had been making bread that morning too, and she remembered calling out to him to be careful, remembered his laugh, remembered the way the door had closed behind him with such finality. The shots had rung out an hour later, echoing through the small town like thunder. 3 men had tried to rob the bank, and Zachary had been in the wrong place at the wrong moment. The sheriff had said he died trying to protect Mrs. Cooper, who had been standing near him when the shooting started. They called him a hero, but Zelda would have traded all the heroism in the world for one more ordinary day with her husband. She set the dough aside to rise and moved back to the window, unable to help herself. The street was busier now, with wagons rolling past and men heading to the saloon or the livery stable. Pahrump was a small town, barely more than a way station for people heading to California or coming back from it, but it had been home for the 5 years of her marriage. Now it felt like a prison. A tall figure caught her attention, a man on horseback moving slowly down the street. Even from a distance, there was something about the way he sat his horse that spoke of weariness that went beyond the physical. He wore a dusty brown coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and he led a pack horse loaded with supplies. As he drew closer, Zelda found herself studying him with an attention that surprised her. She had barely noticed other people in the weeks since Zachary's death, too wrapped up in her own grief to care about the comings and goings of strangers. The man stopped in front of the general store and dismounted with the careful movements of someone who had been riding for a long time. He tied his horses and stood for a moment, looking up and down the street as if getting his bearings. Then he turned toward the store, and for just an instant, his gaze seemed to sweep past her window. Zelda stepped back instinctively, though she knew he could not have seen her through the glass. She turned away, annoyed with herself for wasting time watching strangers. The bread needed her attention, and she had other orders to fill. Mrs. Cooper from the bank had requested 2 pies for a gathering, and Zelda needed the money too badly to refuse, even though the thought of baking for the woman her husband had died protecting filled her with complicated emotions she could not quite name. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of flour and sugar, and by noon, Zelda had 3 loaves of bread cooling on the counter and 2 apple pies ready for delivery. She wrapped them carefully and loaded them into her basket, then forced herself to walk out into the bright afternoon sun. The heat hit her like a wall, even though it was October, and she had to pause on her porch to adjust to it. The walk to town was short, but every step felt like a trial. People nodded to her as she passed, their faces carefully arranged into expressions of sympathy that made her want to scream. She kept her eyes forward and her pace steady, determined to finish her errands and return to the safety of her empty house. The general store was busy when she arrived, and she had to wait while Mr. Peterson helped other customers. She set her basket on the counter and tried to make herself invisible, but it was impossible in a town this size. Mrs. Henderson was there, along with several other women from the church, and they immediately surrounded her with questions and unwanted advice. "You look so thin, dear Mrs. Henderson said, touching Zelda's arm with unwelcome familiarity. "Are you eating enough? You must keep your strength up." "I am fine," Zelda repeated, the words becoming a mantra that meant nothing. "Have you thought about what you will do for the winter?" Another woman asked. "You cannot stay in that house alone. It is not right." Before Zelda could respond, a deep voice cut through the conversation. "Excuse me, ladies. I need to speak with Mr. Peterson." They all turned to find the stranger Zelda had seen that morning standing behind them, his hat now in his hands, revealing dark hair threaded with gray and a face weathered by sun and wind. His eyes were a startling blue, and when they met Zelda's, she saw something in them that made her breath catch. It was grief, raw and unmistakable, the same grief she saw in her own mirror every morning. The women scattered like startled chickens, and the man moved to the counter, setting down a list of supplies. Mr. Peterson greeted him warmly, clearly familiar with him, and began gathering items from the shelves. Zelda stood frozen, her basket still on the counter, unable to look away from the stranger even though she knew she should. "Mrs. Matthews," Mr. Peterson said, noticing her finally. "Let me get your payment. The bread sold out within an hour yesterday. You have a gift." Zelda murmured her thanks and accepted the coins he counted into her palm. She should have left then, should have walked away and returned to her solitude, but something kept her rooted in place. The stranger was asking about winter supplies, his voice low and measured, and she found herself listening despite herself. "You staying through the cold months then, Turner?" Mr. Peterson asked. "Thinking about it," the man replied. His name was Turner then. "Ranch needs work and I've got nowhere else to be." "Good to hear. Town could use more steady folks. Sorry about your loss, by the way. I heard about your wife. Terrible thing, sickness like that." The stranger Turner nodded once, his jaw tightening. "Thank you." Zelda's heart constricted. So he was a widower too. That explained the grief in his eyes, the bone-deep weariness in his posture. She picked up her basket and forced herself to move toward the door, but as she passed him, Their eyes met again, and this time there was a flash of recognition between them. Not of faces, but of shared pain, of understanding that needed no words. She fled into the sunshine, her heart pounding for reasons she could not explain. The encounter had lasted seconds, but it had shaken something loose inside her, some awareness that she was not as alone in her suffering as she had believed. Other people carried similar burdens, moved through their days with the same weight pressing on their shoulders, and somehow that knowledge was both comforting and terrifying. The delivery to Mrs. Cooper went quickly, and Zelda found herself back home before the afternoon heat had fully settled. She sat on her porch with a cup of lukewarm tea and allowed herself to think about the stranger, Turner. She knew the ranch he must have bought. It was the old Morrison place, about 3 miles outside town. It had been empty for 2 years, the house falling into disrepair, the land overgrown. If he was planning to winter there, he had a lot of work ahead of him. She wondered about his wife, about what illness had taken her. She wondered if he woke in the night reaching for someone who was no longer there, if he caught himself setting 2 plates for meals before remembering he was alone. She wondered if his grief was as sharp as hers, as all-consuming, or if he had somehow found a way to carry it that did not feel like drowning. The sun was setting when she finally went inside, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that Zachary would have loved. She stood at the window again, watching the light fade, and for the first time in 3 months, she felt a flicker of something that was not quite hope but was not despair either. It was awareness, perhaps, or curiosity, or simply the recognition that life continued even when you wanted it to stop. The next morning brought rain, a rare gift in the desert, and Zelda spent it inside, working on a quilt she had started before Zachary died. Her fingers moved automatically through the familiar motions, but her mind was restless, circling back again and again to the blue-eyed stranger and the grief she had recognized in him. She told herself she was being foolish, that one brief encounter meant nothing, but she could not shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the universe had tilted slightly on its axis. When the rain stopped in the afternoon, she decided to walk to the cemetery. She had not visited Zachary's grave in 2 weeks, unable to face the finality of the headstone with his name carved into it. But today, for reasons she could not articulate, she felt drawn there. The cemetery was at the edge of town, a small plot of land surrounded by a low wooden fence. Zachary's grave was near the back, under a scraggly cottonwood tree that provided meager shade. Zelda knelt beside it, pulling weeds that had sprung up after the rain, and let herself cry for the first time in weeks. The tears came hot and fast, a release of pressure that had been building for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to let it out. "I miss you," she whispered to the earth. "I do not know how to do this without you." The wind rustled through the cottonwood leaves, but there was no answer, no sign, no comfort beyond what she could manufacture for herself. She stayed until her knees ached and her tears were spent, then stood and brushed the dirt from her skirt. As she walked back through the cemetery, she noticed a figure standing at a grave on the opposite side, a tall man in a familiar brown coat. Her heart jumped before her mind caught up. It was Turner, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of sorrow that bent his spine. Zelda hesitated, caught between the urge to approach him and the instinct to leave him to his private grief. In the end, she chose a middle path, walking quietly toward the gate but allowing her footsteps to be audible so she would not startle him. He looked up as she drew near, and their eyes met for the 3rd time. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Turner cleared his throat and nodded. "Madam, sir," Zelda replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are Mrs. Matthews," he said, and it was not quite a question. "I am, and you are Mr. Turner." He nodded again, his gaze dropping back to the grave before him. Zelda could not see a headstone, and she realized with a start that there was not one yet. The grave was fresh, the earth still dark and unsettled. "I am sorry for your loss," she said, the words inadequate but sincere, "and I for yours. I heard about your husband, the bank robbery." "Yes." The silence stretched between them, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood that words could not fill the emptiness, that sometimes the only thing to do was stand in it together. It does not get easier, does it? Zelda found herself asking, the question escaping before she could stop it. Turner looked at her again, and this time his eyes held something besides grief. There was understanding there and a terrible honesty. "No, but you learned to carry it." She nodded, her throat tight. "How long?" "My wife died 8 months ago. Fever took her in 2 days. I am sorry. So am I." They stood there for another moment, two strangers united by loss, and then Turner put his hat back on. "I should get back to the ranch, a lot of work to do before winter." "Of course. Good day, Mr. Turner." "Good day, Mrs. Matthews." She watched him walk away, his stride long and purposeful despite the weight he carried, and she felt that flicker again, that sense of something shifting. She did not know what it meant, but for the first time since Zachary's death, she felt a tiny spark of interest in the world beyond her own pain. The days that followed took on a new rhythm. Zelda continued her baking, continued her solitary existence, but she found herself thinking about Turner at odd moments. She wondered how he was managing at the ranch, whether he was eating properly, whether he had managed to fix the roof before the next rain. She told herself it was simple human concern, nothing more, but she could not quite convince herself that was the whole truth. She saw him again the following week when she was making a delivery to the general store. He was loading supplies onto his packhorse, and when he saw her, he touched his hat in greeting. She nodded back, and that might have been the end of it, but Mr. Peterson called out to her, "Mrs. Matthews, you still have those preserves you mentioned. Mr. Turner here is looking for something to see him through the winter, and I told him your work is the best in the county." Zelda felt her face warm. "I have a few jars left. I could bring them by tomorrow." "That would be fine," Turner said, his voice neutral but his eyes kind. "What do you charge?" They discussed prices, and Zelda found herself agreeing to bring a dozen jars to the ranch the next afternoon. As she walked home, she tried to ignore the flutter in her stomach, the nervousness that felt suspiciously like anticipation. It was just a business transaction, she told herself. Nothing more. But that night, she found herself choosing her best dress, the dark blue one that Zachary had always liked, and she spent extra time braiding her hair. She told herself it was simple pride, that she did not want to show up at a customer's door looking like a beggar, but the lie felt thin even to her own ears. The ride to the Morrison Ranch took her almost an hour. She borrowed a horse and cart from Mr. Peterson, paying him with a promise of fresh bread, and set out under a sky that threatened rain but held back. The ranch appeared suddenly as she crested a small hill, and she was surprised by what she saw. The house still needed work, but someone had been busy. The porch had been repaired, new shingles gleamed on part of the roof, and the barn door hung straight on its hinges. Smoke rose from the chimney, and as she drew closer, she saw Turner working in the corral, mending the fence. He looked up at the sound of her approach and set down his tools, wiping his hands on his pants as he walked over to meet her. He had rolled up his sleeves, and she could see the muscles in his forearms, the tan lines that spoke of long hours in the sun. "Mrs. Matthews," he said, reaching up to help her down from the cart. His hands were warm and calloused, and Zelda felt a jolt at the contact that surprised her. It had been so long since anyone had touched her with such casual kindness. "Mr. Turner, I brought your preserves. Please call me Thomas." Mr. Turner was my father. "Then you must call me Zelda." He smiled slightly, the expression transforming his solemn face. "Zelda it is." They unloaded the jars together, and Thomas insisted she come inside for water before the ride back. Zelda hesitated, aware of the impropriety of entering a widower's home alone, but her throat was dry, and the prospect of immediate departure felt wrong somehow. The inside of the house was surprisingly tidy, if sparse. Thomas had clearly been focusing on the essential repairs first. The floor was swept clean, and a small fire burned in the fireplace. A single chair sat near the window, and a bedroll was laid out in the corner. It was the home of a man who had not yet settled, who was still existing rather than living. "It is not much," Thomas said, following her gaze. "But it will do for the winter." "You have done a lot of work already," Zelda observed, accepting the cup of water he offered. "The place looks much better than it did. It keeps me busy, that helps." She understood exactly what he meant. "Yes, the baking does the same for me." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, and then Thomas cleared his throat. "Would you like to sit? That chair is the only one I have got, but I can bring in a stool from the barn." "I should get back before it gets dark," Zelda said, even though part of her wanted to stay, to keep talking to this man who understood her grief without needing explanation. "Of course. Let me pay you for the preserves." They handled the transaction, and then Thomas walked her back to the cart. As he helped her up, he paused, his hand lingering on hers for just a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for coming all this way," he said quietly. "It was good to have company, even briefly." "Thank you for the business," Zelda replied, her heart beating faster than it should. She drove away without looking back, but she could feel his eyes on her until she crested the hill and disappeared from view. The ride back to Pahrump felt longer than the ride out, and her mind was full of thoughts she had no business thinking. She barely knew Thomas Turner. He was a customer, nothing more. The fact that he was also a widower, that he understood her pain, that his rare smile made her stomach flutter, all of that was irrelevant. But that night, for the first time in 3 months, Zelda did not dream of Zachary's death. Instead, she dreamed of blue eyes and calloused hands, and woke feeling guilty and confused and more alive than she had felt in weeks. The guilt stayed with her through the following days. She felt as if she were betraying Zachary's memory by thinking about another man, even in the most innocent way. She threw herself into her baking with renewed fervor, trying to exhaust herself enough that she could not think, but it did not work. Thomas Turner had taken up residence in her mind, and she could not evict him. When he appeared at her door a week later, his hat in his hands and uncertainty in his eyes, her heart leaped before she could stop it. "Mr. Turner," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Is something wrong with the preserves?" "No, they are excellent. I ate half a jar with dinner last night." He shifted his weight, looking uncharacteristically awkward. "I came to ask if you might be willing to make more. I will pay whatever you ask." "Of course. How many jars would you like?" "A dozen, if you can spare them." "And—" He trailed off, then seemed to gather his courage. "And I wondered if you might need any help with repairs around your place. I noticed some loose boards on your porch, and winter will be here before we know it." "I am good with my hands, and I would not charge much." Zelda's first instinct was to refuse. She could not afford to hire help, and besides, what would people say if Thomas Turner started spending time at her house? But even as the objections formed, she found herself nodding. "That would be helpful. The porch does need attention, and the roof leaked during the last rain, but I cannot afford to pay much. We can work out a trade." Repairs for baking. I am tired of my own cooking. It was a practical arrangement, Zelda told herself. Nothing more. But as she watched Thomas walk away, his stride confident now that the awkward conversation was over, she could not deny the warmth spreading through her chest. He came the next morning with his tools and set to work on the porch while Zelda baked inside. She found herself listening to the sound of his hammer, the creak of boards being replaced, the low whistle he let out occasionally when he was focused. It was oddly comforting, having another person's presence nearby, and she realized how much she had missed the simple companionship of shared space. Around noon, she brought him water and cornbread, and they sat on the newly repaired porch steps together. The October sun was warm but not oppressive, and the mountains in the distance wore their purple haze like a cloak. "You do good work," Zelda said, examining the smooth boards beneath her feet. "So do you. This cornbread is the best I have had since." He trailed off, and Zelda knew he had been about to say, "since my wife died." "What was her name?" she asked gently. "Your wife." "Sarah." "Sarah Newhouse before we married. We met in Texas, got married young, thought we had forever." His voice was rough. "Turned out forever was only 6 years. Zachary and I had 5, Zelda said. We thought we would grow old together, have children, grandchildren, build a life." "What happened to him?" "I heard it was a robbery, but not the details." So Zelda told him, and found that the words came easier than they had before. She told him about the morning, about the bread she had been making, about the sound of gunshots and the terrible running through town to find her husband bleeding on the bank floor. She told him about the funeral, about the empty house, about the suffocating sympathy of the townspeople who did not understand that their pity made everything worse. Thomas listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah got sick on a Tuesday," he said finally. "By Wednesday she was fevered. By Thursday morning she was gone. I did not even get to say a proper goodbye. She was delirious at the end, calling out for her mother who died years ago. I held her hand, but I do not think she knew I was there." "I am so sorry." "Me too. For both of us." They sat in silence after that, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind shared by people who had been through something terrible and survived it. When Thomas went back to work, Zelda felt lighter somehow, as if sharing her story had released some of the pressure that had been building inside her. Over the following weeks, Thomas became a regular presence at Zelda's house. He fixed the roof, repaired the fence, replaced the broken window in the bedroom that she had been covering with cloth. In return, she kept him fed with bread and stew and pies, and slowly, carefully, they began to talk about more than just grief. She learned that he was 32, that he had grown up on a ranch in Texas, that he had moved to Nevada looking for a fresh start after Sarah's death. He learned that she was 28, that she had been an orphan before Zachary found her working in a Denver boarding house, that she had always wanted to learn to ride properly, but had never had the courage to try. "I could teach you," Thomas offered one afternoon as they sat on her porch watching the sunset. "You should know how to ride, especially living out here." "I would probably fall off and break my neck," Zelda said, but she was smiling. "Not if I taught you. I am a good teacher. Patient." So the next Sunday, which was Zelda's day off from baking, Thomas showed up with a gentle mare named Daisy, and they spent the afternoon in a meadow outside town while he taught her the basics of riding. Zelda was terrified at first, convinced she would humiliate herself, but Thomas's steady presence and calm instructions gave her confidence. By the end of the day, she could walk Daisy around the meadow without clutching the saddle horn in terror, and her face hurt from smiling. "See," Thomas said, grinning up at her. "I told you that you could do it." "I cannot believe I did that," Zelda said, breathless and exhilarated. Zachary always wanted to teach me, but I was too afraid. The mention of her husband brought a brief shadow across the day, but it passed quickly. Thomas helped her down from Daisy, his hands steady on her waist, and for a moment they stood close enough that Zelda could see the gold flecks in his blue eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "My pleasure." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition that they had crossed an invisible line from acquaintances to friends, and perhaps to something more. Neither of them spoke of it, but as they rode back to town, Zelda with Thomas leading Daisy, the air felt charged with possibility. The town, of course, noticed. Mrs. Henderson was the first to comment, stopping Zelda outside the church the following Sunday. "I see you have been spending time with Mr. Turner," she said, her tone rich with implication. "He has been helping with repairs," Zelda replied evenly. Of course. It is just that people talk, dear. Two young widowed people spending so much time together, well, you know how it looks." "I do not much care how it looks," Zelda said, surprising herself with her bluntness. "Mr. Turner is a friend, and I need friends right now more than I need the approval of gossips." She walked away before Mrs. Henderson could respond, her heart pounding but her head high. She was tired of living according to other people's expectations, tired of performing grief in the way they thought appropriate. Thomas Turner understood her in ways no one else did, and she would not give up that understanding to satisfy the town's sense of propriety. But the encounter troubled her nonetheless, and that evening when Thomas came by to check on a shutter that had been sticking, she told him about it. "We can stop if you want," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I do not want to make your life harder." "No," Zelda said firmly. "I do not want to stop. I like having you around. You make things better." He smiled, that rare, transforming smile that made her stomach flutter. "You make things better too. I did not realize how much I had been just going through the motions until I met you. You reminded me that it is possible to feel something besides grief." "Is that what this is?" Zelda asked, emboldened by his honesty. "Feeling something?" Thomas took a step closer and Zelda's breath caught. "I think it might be, if you feel it too." "I do," she whispered. "But I feel guilty about it, like I am betraying Zachary." "I know. I feel the same about Sarah, but I do not think they would want us to be miserable forever. I think they would want us to live." He was right. Zelda knew he was right, but knowing and believing were different things. Still, when he reached out and took her hand, she let him, and the warmth of his palm against hers felt like coming home. "Can we go slow?" she asked. "I need time to figure out what this means." "As slow as you need," Thomas promised. "I am not going anywhere," and he did not. Through November and into December, he was a constant presence in her life, always respectful, never pushing, but always there. They took walks together, shared meals, talked about everything from philosophy to the price of grain. He taught her to ride better, and she taught him to bake bread. They visited the cemetery together and stood in companionable silence beside their spouses' graves, honoring their memories while slowly, carefully, building something new. The first snowfall came in mid-December, blanketing Pahrump in unexpected white. Zelda woke to find the world transformed, and her first thought was that she wanted to share it with Thomas. The realization made her pause, made her examine what was happening between them with clearer eyes. She cared for him, she realized. More than cared. She was falling in love with him, if she had not already fallen. The knowledge should have terrified her, but instead, it felt right, like a piece of herself clicking back into place. When he arrived that afternoon, snow dusting his coat and his cheeks red from the cold, she opened the door and made a decision. "Come in," she said. "I made coffee and we need to talk." He followed her inside, concern creasing his forehead. "Is something wrong?" "No, or maybe yes." "I do not know." Zelda poured them both coffee with shaking hands and sat across from him at her small table. "Thomas, what are we doing?" "What do you mean, this, us? We spend every day together, we hold hands, we share things we have not shared with anyone else. What is this?" Thomas set down his cup and looked at her with those blue eyes that saw through all her defenses. "What do you want it to be?" "I want it to be real," Zelda said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I want to stop feeling guilty for caring about you. I want to stop pretending that you are just a friend when you are so much more than that." "You are more than a friend to me too," Thomas said quietly. "Zelda, I think I am falling in love with you. I did not mean for it to happen, and I know it is too soon, and I know it is complicated, but it is the truth." Zelda felt tears prick her eyes. "I think I am falling in love with you too, and I feel terrible about it, like I am leaving Zachary behind, but I cannot help it. You make me want to live again." Thomas reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "You are not leaving him behind. You are carrying him with you while moving forward. There is a difference." "How do you know that?" "Because that is what I am doing with Sarah. She will always be part of me, part of my story. But she would want me to be happy, and I think Zachary would want the same for you." Zelda knew he was right. Zachary had been a kind man, a generous man. He would not have wanted her to spend the rest of her life alone and grieving. But knowing it intellectually and feeling it emotionally were different things. "I need more time," she said finally, "but I want you to know that I do care for you, very much." "Take all the time you need," Thomas said. "I will be here." Christmas came, and Zelda found herself invited to the church celebration. She almost declined, not wanting to face the judgment of people like Mrs. Henderson, but Thomas convinced her to go. They walked in together, and the sight of them caused a stir of whispers, but Zelda kept her head high. She had nothing to be ashamed of. The celebration was pleasant, with carols and cookies and a sense of community that Zelda had been missing. But the best part was afterward, when Thomas walked her home through the snowy streets, and they stood on her porch under a sky full of stars. "I have something for you," he said, pulling a small package from his pocket. "It is not much, but I saw it and thought of you." Zelda unwrapped it to find a small carved wooden bird, smooth and perfect. "It is beautiful," she breathed. "I made it. I used to carve when I was younger, and I have been getting back into it. This is a mourning dove. I thought maybe it was fitting, you know. Something that carries sadness but is still beautiful." Zelda traced the delicate wings with her finger, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Thank you, I love it. I am glad." They stood in silence for a moment, and then Zelda made another decision, one that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She leaned forward and kissed him, soft and brief, on the lips. Thomas froze for a heartbeat, then kissed her back, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with infinite tenderness. When they pulled apart, Zelda was shaking, but it was not from fear. It was from the rush of feeling, of allowing herself to want something again, to hope for something beyond survival. "Was that all right?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. "That was more than all right," Thomas said, his voice rough. "But are you sure? I do not want you to do anything you will regret." "I am sure," Zelda said, and she was. "I am ready to move forward, with you." His smile was brighter than the stars overhead. "Then I am the luckiest man in Nevada." They courted properly after that, though by the town's standards they had been courting for months. But now it was acknowledged, official, and that made all the difference. Thomas asked Zelda to marry him in February, kneeling in the mud of her garden where spring flowers were just beginning to push through. And she said yes, without hesitation. The wedding was small, held in April when the desert was in bloom. Only a few friends attended, but Zelda did not care about the size of the celebration. All that mattered was Thomas, standing beside her in his Sunday best, promising to love and cherish her for the rest of their lives. They honeymooned at the ranch, which Thomas had continued to fix up over the winter. It was beautiful now, a real home, and Zelda felt a sense of peace settle over her as they crossed the threshold together. This was a new beginning, a second chance at happiness that neither of them had expected but both desperately needed. Their first night as husband and wife was tender and awkward and perfect. They were both nervous, both comparing their new spouse to the one they had lost, but gradually the past faded into the background, and they were just Thomas and Zelda, two people choosing to build a life together. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt like happiness. Zelda continued her baking, but now she had a full kitchen to work in, and a husband who tested everything. Thomas worked the ranch, building it up slowly but surely, and Zelda helped where she could, learning about cattle and horses and the thousand small tasks that went into keeping a ranch running. They talked about their lost spouses sometimes, late at night when the world was quiet. It was important, Zelda felt, not to pretend that Zachary and Sarah had never existed. They had been real, had been loved, and their memories deserved honor. Thomas agreed, and together they created space in their marriage for the people who had come before, not as ghosts but as cherished parts of their histories. The first real test of their marriage came in August, when Zelda realized she was pregnant. She was terrified to tell Thomas, afraid of what it might mean, afraid of how it might feel to carry a child who was not Zachary's. But when she finally gathered the courage to share the news, Thomas swept her into his arms and spun her around, his joy undeniable. "This is wonderful," he said, setting her down gently. "Are you happy?" "I think I am," Zelda said, examining her feelings carefully. "I did not think I would ever have children. Zachary and I tried, but it never happened. This feels like a gift." "It is a gift," Thomas agreed. "A gift we will cherish." The pregnancy was not easy. Zelda was sick for the first few months, and as she grew larger, the August heat became unbearable. But Thomas was endlessly patient, bringing her water and fanning her and rubbing her swollen feet at the end of each day. His tenderness made her fall in love with him all over again, deeper this time, rooted not just in shared grief, but in shared joy. She went into labor on a cold January evening, almost 9 months after their wedding. Thomas rode to town to fetch the midwife, and then he held Zelda's hand through the long hours of pain and pushing. She screamed his name more than once, and he never flinched, never left her side. Their son was born just before dawn, a tiny red-faced creature who screamed his displeasure at being thrust into the cold world. Zelda held him against her chest and wept, overwhelmed by love so fierce it felt like being torn apart and remade at the same time. "What should we name him?" Thomas asked, stroking the baby's dark hair with a gentle finger. Zelda had been thinking about this. "I want to honor the people we lost," she said. "What was your father's name, Benjamin, and yours?" "I never knew my father, but Zachary's middle name was James." "Benjamin James Turner," Thomas said, testing the sound. "I like it." "Benjamin James Turner," Zelda repeated, smiling down at her son. "Welcome to the world, little one." Benjamin was a colicky baby who cried more than he slept, but Zelda had never been happier. Even in the exhausting fog of new motherhood, she felt complete in a way she had not since Zachary's death. She had a family again, a purpose, a future that stretched beyond mere survival. Thomas was a wonderful father, patient and gentle and endlessly creative at finding ways to soothe their son. He carved toys for Benjamin, sang to him in a surprisingly good voice, and walked the floor with him at all hours of the night. Watching him with their child, Zelda felt her heart expand to hold even more love than she thought possible. The town, which had been so judgmental about their courtship, embraced them now that they were a family. Mrs. Henderson cooed over Benjamin and brought baby clothes she had knitted. The other women offered advice and support, and Zelda found herself part of a community in a way she had not been even when Zachary was alive. But the best moments were the quiet ones, when it was just the three of them at the ranch. Thomas would come in from working, dusty and tired, and find Zelda nursing Benjamin by the fire. He would sit beside them, his hand on her shoulder, and they would exist in perfect contentment, needing nothing more than each other. Benjamin grew quickly, reaching for things and rolling over and developing a personality that was all his own. He had Zelda's dark hair and Thomas's blue eyes, and he was fearless in a way that both delighted and terrified his parents. By his first birthday, he was walking and getting into everything, and the house rang with his laughter and their attempts to keep him out of trouble. On the evening of Benjamin's first birthday, after they had put him to bed, and the house was quiet, Thomas pulled Zelda into his arms on the porch. They stood there under the stars, swaying slightly, and Zelda thought about how far she had come from that broken woman standing at her window 18 months ago. "Are you happy?" Thomas asked, the same question he had asked when she told him about the pregnancy. "So happy I can hardly believe it," Zelda said honestly. "I never thought I would feel this way again. You gave me my life back." "You gave me mine too," Thomas said. "When I came to this town, I was just existing, going through the motions. You reminded me what it felt like to live." They stood there a while longer, holding each other, and Zelda sent up a silent thank you to Zachary. She would always love him, would always carry him in her heart, but she no longer belonged to the past. She belonged to the present, to the future, to the man who held her and the child sleeping in the next room. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch prospered, and Thomas bought more land and more cattle. Zelda's baking business grew until she had more orders than she could fill, and they hired a girl from town to help her. Benjamin grew into a sturdy, adventurous boy who loved horses and seemed destined to follow in his father's footsteps. When Benjamin was 3, Zelda became pregnant again, and this time the process was easier. She knew what to expect, and her body seemed to handle it better. Their daughter arrived on a beautiful spring morning, tiny and perfect, with Thomas's golden hair and Zelda's dark eyes. They named her Rose Sarah Turner, honoring Thomas's late wife, and the choice felt right, a bridge between their past and present. Benjamin was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to hold her or show her his toys. Thomas watched them together with shining eyes, and Zelda knew he was thinking about the family he had always wanted with Sarah, the one that illness had stolen from them. But there was no bitterness in his expression, only gratitude for what they had now. Life settled into a comfortable pattern. The ranch thrived, the children grew, and Thomas and Zelda's love deepened with each passing season. They still visited the cemetery sometimes, standing together at the graves of their first spouses, but the visits grew less frequent as the years passed. The grief had not disappeared, but it had transformed, becoming a quiet sadness rather than a sharp pain. When Benjamin was 7 and Rose was 4, Zelda realized she was pregnant again. She was 36 now, and the pregnancy felt different, heavier, more tiring. But when their second daughter was born, a red-faced screamer with a temper to match, Zelda felt the same overwhelming love she had felt with the others. They named her Clara, after Thomas's mother, and she completed their family in a way Zelda had not known they needed. The house was chaos with 3 children, but it was joyful chaos. Benjamin was responsible and helpful, often entertaining his sisters while his parents worked. Rose was sweet and artistic, always drawing pictures or making up songs. Clara was wild and fearless, constantly getting into scrapes that made Thomas laugh even as he scolded her. Thomas built an addition onto the house to accommodate their growing family, and Zelda filled it with quilts and curtains and all the homey touches that made it truly theirs. They hosted dinners for friends from town, and their table was always full of laughter and good food, and the kind of contentment that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas surprised Zelda with a trip to Virginia City. They left the children with a trusted neighbor and spent 3 days exploring the bustling mining town, eating in restaurants and sleeping late and remembering what it was like to be just a couple rather than parents. It was wonderful, but by the 3rd day they both missed the chaos of home and returned early, laughing at themselves for being so eager to get back to the noise and mess. As Zelda approached 40, she realized she was content in a way she had never imagined possible after Zachary's death. She had a husband who loved her, children who filled her days with purpose and joy, and a home that was truly hers. The pain of loss was still there, a thread woven into the fabric of who she was, but it no longer defined her. Thomas had gray threading through his dark hair now, and lines had deepened around his eyes, but to Zelda, he was more handsome than ever. The way he looked at her had not changed in all their years together, that combination of desire and respect and deep, abiding love. She felt the same way about him, grateful every day that they had found each other in their grief and built something beautiful from the ashes. Benjamin grew into a strong, capable young man who worked the ranch alongside his father. At 18, he was already taller than Thomas, with his mother's serious nature and his father's steady hands. He had a girlfriend in town, a sweet girl named Mary, and Zelda suspected they would be married within the year. Rose at 15 was turning heads in town, though she seemed oblivious to the attention. She helped Zelda with the baking and had a gift for decorating cakes that far exceeded her mother's abilities. She talked about opening her own bakery someday, and Zelda had no doubt she would succeed. Clara at 11 was still wild, still fearless, but she had developed a love for horses that matched her father's. Thomas said she was a natural rider, better even than Benjamin had been at that age, and they had long conversations about breeding and training that Zelda only half understood. Life was not perfect. They had struggles with money sometimes, when cattle prices were low or drought threatened the ranch. The children fought and got sick and broke Zelda's heart with growing pains she could not fix. Thomas injured his back one year and was laid up for weeks, restless and frustrated and terrible at being patient. But through all of it, they had each other, and that made everything bearable. On a summer evening when Benjamin was 20 and courting Mary seriously, when Rose was 17 and dreaming of her bakery, when Clara was 13 and spending more time in the barn than the house, Zelda stood on her porch and looked out at the land she now thought of as truly hers. The sun was setting, painting the sky in those impossible colors that still took her breath away, and she felt Thomas come up behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. "How lucky I am," Zelda said simply. "How far we have come. We have come far, have we not? Sometimes I think about that day in the general store when I first saw you, and I wonder what would have happened if I had not gathered the courage to offer to help with your repairs." "I think we would have found each other anyway," Zelda said, turning in his arms to face him. "Some things are meant to be. You really believe that?" "I do. I believe that Zachary and Sarah brought us together in a way. That they gave us the capacity to love deeply and the understanding of how precious it is. We would not be who we are without them." Thomas kissed her forehead. "You are wise, Mrs. Turner. I am old, Mr. Turner. You are beautiful." They stood there as the sun disappeared and the stars came out, holding each other the way they had countless times before, and Zelda felt at peace. The grief that had once consumed her was still there, a quiet companion, but it no longer ruled her life. She had learned to carry it, just as Thomas had said she would, and in learning to carry it, she had discovered that she could carry joy too, in equal measure. The sound of laughter drifted from inside the house, where their children were gathered around the dinner table, waiting for their parents. Clara was probably telling one of her wild stories, and Rose was probably rolling her eyes, and Benjamin was probably trying to maintain order. It was the sound of family, of life continuing, of love multiplied and shared. "We should go in," Zelda said, but she did not move. "In a minute," Thomas replied, tightening his hold on her. So they stood there a minute longer, and then another, stealing this quiet moment before returning to the beautiful chaos of their lives. When they finally went inside, hand in hand, they were greeted by the sight of their children gathered around the table, their faces bright in the lamplight, and Zelda's heart swelled with gratitude. This was not the life she had imagined when she married Zachary Matthews all those years ago in Pahrump, Nevada. That life had ended in gunfire and grief, and for a long time she had thought she would never be whole again. But Thomas Turner had seen her broken pieces and had not turned away. He had offered his hand, offered his understanding, offered his own broken pieces, and together they had created something new. As she sat down at the table and began serving the meal, surrounded by the people she loved most in the world, Zelda thought about the young widow who had stood at the window watching dust devils scatter across the street. She wanted to reach back through time and tell that woman that it would be all right. That grief was not the end of her story, but the beginning of a new chapter. She wanted to tell her that love was possible again, that happiness was waiting just around the corner in the form of a blue-eyed cowboy who understood loss as deeply as she did. But she could not reach back, so instead, she reached forward, taking Thomas's hand under the table and squeezing it gently. He squeezed back, and in that small gesture was an entire conversation, an acknowledgement of everything they had survived and everything they had built together. The meal was loud and messy, with Clara spilling her milk and Benjamin teasing Rose about her latest cake disaster, and Thomas telling stories about his day on the ranch. It was ordinary and extraordinary all at once, the kind of moment that Zelda knew she would remember forever, that she would carry with her as proof that life could be good again after tragedy, that love could bloom in unexpected places, that grief and joy could coexist in the same heart. After dinner, they all went out to the porch to watch the stars come out, a family tradition that had started years ago and never stopped. Benjamin sat on the steps with his arm around Mary, who had joined them for dinner. Rose leaned against the railing, humming one of her made-up songs. Clara sat on Thomas's lap even though she was really too big for it, and Zelda stood beside them, her hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Tell us about how you met," Clara demanded, as she often did. She never tired of the story. Thomas and Zelda exchanged a glance, and then Thomas began the familiar tale. He told it well, with just enough detail to make it interesting but not so much that it became maudlin. He talked about being lost in grief, about coming to Pahrump looking for a fresh start, about seeing Zelda at the general store and recognizing a kindred spirit. Zelda picked up the story from there, talking about how Thomas had offered to help with repairs, how they had become friends, how friendship had slowly, carefully, grown into something more. She did not hide the fact that they had both been married before, that they had both lost spouses they loved. It was important, she felt, for their children to understand that their family was built on a foundation of loss as well as love, that both things were true and valid. "And then Papa asked Mama to marry him in the mud," Rose said, giggling. She loved this part. It was not mud, it was damp soil, Thomas protested, as he always did. It was mud, Zelda confirmed, smiling, but it was perfect anyway. As the story wound to its familiar conclusion, with their small wedding and the beginning of their life together, Zelda looked around at her family and felt a wave of emotion so strong it almost knocked her off her feet. This was what she had fought for, what she had survived for, even when she did not know she was fighting and surviving. This moment, this family, this love. Later, after the children had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Thomas and Zelda lay together in their room, watching moonlight paint patterns on the ceiling. "You ever wonder what Zachary would think of all this?" Thomas asked quietly. Zelda had thought about this often over the years. "I think he would be happy for me, for us. He was a good man and he loved me. He would want me to be happy. I hope Sarah would feel the same. I am sure she would. You honor her memory by being a good man, by being a good father and husband. That is all anyone could ask." They lay in silence for a while, and then Thomas said, "I never thought I would have this again. A family. Love. I thought that part of my life was over. So did I, but we were wrong, beautifully wrong." Zelda turned onto her side to face him, tracing the familiar lines of his face with her finger. "I love you, Thomas Turner. I loved Zachary, and I will always carry him with me, but I love you just as much. Differently, but just as much. I love you too, Zelda Turner. And I am grateful every day that we found each other." They kissed, soft and sweet, and then settled into sleep, wrapped in each other's arms. Outside, an owl hooted, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang to the moon. The ranch was quiet, the children were safe, and all was well in their corner of Nevada. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Benjamin married Mary in a lovely ceremony at the church in Pahrump, and they built a house on the edge of Thomas and Zelda's property. Within a year, they had made Thomas and Zelda grandparents, a healthy baby boy they named Timothy. Zelda cried the first time she held her grandson, overwhelmed by the continuation of their family line, by the proof that life went on. Rose did open her bakery, partnering with Zelda and taking over most of the business as Zelda grew older. She was brilliant at it, creating cakes and pastries that drew customers from towns as far as 50 miles away. She married at 22, a kind man named Samuel who supported her ambitions and loved her fierceness. Clara, true to form, did not settle down young. She worked the ranch with her father and Benjamin, proving herself as capable as any man. She broke hearts left and right in Pahrump, but she seemed in no hurry to marry, content with her horses and her freedom. Thomas said she reminded him of himself at that age, restless and searching, and that she would settle when she was ready. Thomas and Zelda grew older together, their hair graying, their bodies slowing down, but their love never diminishing. If anything, it deepened with time, the way a river carves deeper into rock, becoming more essential, more fundamental. They still held hands when they walked, still stole kisses when no one was looking, still looked at each other with the same combination of desire and affection that had marked their early days. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party at the ranch. It seemed like half of Pahrump showed up, bearing gifts and well wishes and memories of watching Thomas and Zelda's love story unfold. Even Mrs. Henderson came, ancient now and softened with age, and she admitted that she had been wrong to judge them in the beginning. "You two are proof that love can bloom in the darkest times," she said, her eyes watery. "I am glad you did not listen to me." Zelda hugged her, feeling magnanimous in her happiness. "We all do the best we can with what we know at the time." As the party wound down and the guests departed, Thomas and Zelda stood on their porch once again, looking out at the land that had seen so much of their lives. Benjamin's house glowed with lamplight in the distance, and they could hear the faint sound of their grandchildren playing. Rose and Samuel had driven back to town, but they would return tomorrow for Sunday dinner. Clara was in the barn, tending to a mare that was about to foal. 25 years, Thomas mused. How is that possible? Time moves quickly when you are happy, Zelda said. Have you been happy? Truly. Truly, Zelda confirmed. There have been hard times, of course, but yes, I have been happy. You have made me happy. Thomas pulled her close, and they swayed slightly, as if dancing to music only they could hear. I used to think that grief was the end of the story, he said. But you taught me it was just the middle. The end is this: love, family, a life well lived. The end is not here yet, Zelda pointed out. We have more life to live. Then I look forward to every moment of it. They stood there until the stars came out in full force, a glittering canopy above them, and Zelda thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. She thought about standing at her window in grief, unable to imagine a future without Zachary. She thought about Thomas offering his hand, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. She thought about learning to trust again, to hope again, to love again. She thought about the people who had helped them along the way, the friends who had supported them, the community that had eventually embraced them. She thought about Benjamin, Rose, and Clara, the children who had never known their mother's first husband but who carried pieces of him nonetheless in the values Zelda had taught them. Most of all, she thought about Thomas, about the quiet strength he had shown in his own grief, about the patience with which he had courted her, about the love he had poured into their family. He had saved her in a way, but she had saved him too. That was the beauty of it, the reciprocity of their love. As she grew older, Zelda found herself thinking more often about Zachary. Not with the sharp pain of early grief, but with a gentle nostalgia, a fondness for the life they had briefly shared. She visited his grave occasionally, bringing flowers and telling him about their children, about the grandchildren he never got to meet, about the good life she had built after he was gone. She liked to think he was proud of her, that he was happy she had found love again. She thought about Sarah too sometimes, the woman she had never met but whose loss had shaped Thomas into the man he became. She wondered what Sarah would think of her, of their children, of the family they had created together. She hoped Sarah would approve, would be glad that Thomas had not spent his life alone. The seasons turned as they always did. Springs brought new calves and foals, flowers blooming in the desert, and the smell of fresh rain. Summers brought scorching heat that drove everyone to seek shade, long evenings on the porch, and the sound of children's laughter. Autumns brought cooler temperatures, harvest time and preparations for winter. Winters brought snow that transformed the landscape, cozy fires, and the close warmth of family gathered together. Through it all, Thomas and Zelda remained the center, the foundation upon which everything else was built. Their love was the constant, the anchor that kept the family steady through storms and celebrations alike. They argued sometimes, about small things mostly, but they never went to bed angry. They had both lost too much to waste time on petty disagreements. When Zelda was 52 and Thomas was 56, he got sick. It started as a cough that would not go away, then became a tightness in his chest that made breathing difficult. The doctor came from Virginia City and gave them the news they had been dreading. Thomas's lungs were damaged, possibly from years of breathing in dust and smoke, and there was nothing to be done but make him comfortable. The news hit Zelda like a physical blow, dragging her back to that moment 27 years ago when she had learned Zachary was gone. But this was different. This was not sudden and violent. This was slow, a gradual dimming rather than an abrupt extinguishing, and that gave her time to prepare, to say the things that needed to be said. Thomas took the news with characteristic calm. "I've had more than I ever expected," he told Zelda that first night after the diagnosis. 27 good years with you, 3 children, grandchildren. I have been blessed." "I am not ready to lose you," Zelda said, tears streaming down her face. "I know. But we knew this day would come eventually. We are not young anymore, love. We have had our time, and it has been beautiful." The children took turns caring for their father as his condition worsened. Benjamin helped him to the porch each day so he could watch the ranch work continue. Rose baked his favorite foods, trying to tempt his failing appetite. Clara read to him from the adventure novels he loved, her voice steady even as her eyes filled with tears. But it was Zelda who never left his side, who held his hand through the long nights when breathing became a struggle, who whispered memories of their life together when he grew too weak to talk. She told him about the first time she saw him, about how his grief had recognized hers. She told him about learning to ride Daisy, about the carved mourning dove he had given her for Christmas. She told him about their wedding, about Benjamin's birth, about every moment of joy they had shared. "Thank you," Thomas whispered one evening as the sun set outside their window. "Thank you for giving me a second chance at love, at life." "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible," Zelda replied. "Thank you for understanding. Thank you for everything." "Promise me something," Thomas said, his breathing labored. "Promise me you will not stop living when I am gone. You showed me how to live again, and I need you to remember your own lesson." "I promise," Zelda said, though the words felt like ash in her mouth. Thomas Turner died on a clear autumn morning with Zelda holding his hand and his children gathered around him. His last words were, "I love you," and his last expression was peace. Zelda sat with his body for a long time after, memorizing the lines of his face, the feel of his hand in hers, the weight of him beside her one final time. The funeral was large, the church overflowing with people whose lives Thomas had touched in his years in Pahrump. They buried him next to where Zelda had reserved her own plot, and as the first shovelful of dirt hit the casket, Zelda felt something inside her break. But it was not the same break she had experienced with Zachary's death. This was different. Sadder, perhaps, but also somehow more bearable. She had known this was coming, had prepared for it as much as anyone could prepare for such a thing, and she had no regrets. They had said everything that needed saying. The weeks after Thomas's death were difficult. The house felt too empty, too quiet, even with the children constantly checking on her. Zelda found herself going through the motions of living, her body operating on autopilot while her mind existed somewhere else. But slowly, gradually, she came back to herself. She remembered her promise to Thomas, her promise to keep living. Benjamin and Mary insisted she move into their house, but Zelda refused. This ranch was her home, built with Thomas's hands and filled with their memories. She would not abandon it. Instead, Clara moved back in with her, and together they worked the ranch and kept each other company. It was a good arrangement, giving them both what they needed. Zelda found comfort in her grandchildren, in watching them grow and learn and become themselves. She baked with Rose's daughter, taught Benjamin's son to ride, and told Clara's nieces and nephews stories about their grandfather. She kept Thomas alive through stories, through memories shared and treasured. She visited both graves regularly now, Zachary's and Thomas's, and she talked to them both. She told Zachary about the life she had lived after losing him, hoping he understood, believing he did. She told Thomas about the daily happenings of the ranch, about the children and grandchildren, keeping him connected to the life he had left behind. Years passed. Zelda grew old, her dark hair turning white, her body slowing down. But her mind remained sharp and her heart remained full. She had loved deeply twice, had lost deeply twice, and she bore both loves and both losses with equal grace. She understood now what Thomas had tried to tell her all those years ago, that grief was not the end but a transformation, a way of carrying love forward even after the beloved was gone. On her 75th birthday, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren, Zelda looked around and felt a profound sense of completion. She had lived a full life, had loved and been loved, had survived loss and found joy again. She had honored both her husbands by living fully, by choosing happiness over despair, by building something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. That night, alone in the house she had shared with Thomas, Zelda stood at the window and looked out at the land bathed in moonlight. She thought about that young widow who had stood in almost this exact spot so many years ago, drowning in grief and unable to see a future. She wanted to reach back and tell her that everything would be all right, that a blue-eyed cowboy was coming who would understand her pain and offer his hand, that love was waiting just around the corner. But she could not reach back, so instead she whispered into the darkness, "Thank you, both of you, for everything." And somewhere, in whatever place the loved and lost inhabit, she liked to imagine that Zachary Matthews and Thomas Turner heard her and smiled. Zelda lived another 10 years after that birthday, a decade filled with the quiet joys of old age. She watched her grandchildren marry and have children of their own. She saw the ranch prosper under Benjamin and Clara's joint management. She saw Rose's bakery expand into a second location in Virginia City. She saw the world change around her, new technologies and ideas coming to Nevada, and she adapted as best she could. But mostly, she existed in memories, in the rich tapestry of a life well lived. She remembered Zachary's laugh and Thomas's steady presence. She remembered her children as babies and as adults. She remembered every small moment of joy that had made up her years, and she held them close, treasuring them. When Zelda died peacefully in her sleep at 85, the family laid her to rest between Zachary and Thomas, exactly where she had always said she wanted to be. The headstone reads simply, "Zelda Matthews Turner, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother," and beneath that, "She loved deeply and was deeply loved." The funeral was enormous, a testament to the life she had lived and the people she had touched. Her children spoke about her strength, her resilience, her capacity for love even after loss. Her grandchildren shared memories of baking sessions and riding lessons and stories told on the porch under the stars. The whole community of Pahrump came to pay respects to a woman who had shown them all what it meant to survive tragedy and choose happiness. As the last mourners departed, and the sun set over the cemetery, casting long shadows across the graves, a mourning dove landed on Zelda's headstone. It sat there for a moment, its mournful call echoing in the evening air, and then it flew away, soaring up into the darkening sky. The ranch continued under Benjamin's leadership, then passed to his children, and then to theirs. Rose's bakery became a Pahrump institution, carried on by her descendants. Clara's daughter became a renowned horse trainer, her love of animals a direct inheritance from her mother and grandfather. The story of Zelda and Thomas became family legend, told and retold through the generations. It was a story about grief and survival, about finding love in unexpected places, about the courage it takes to open your heart after it has been broken. It was a story that reminded every new generation that loss was not the end, that life continued, that love was always possible if you were brave enough to reach for it. And so the legacy lived on, carried forward by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who never knew Zelda Matthews Turner but who lived by the example she had set. They loved deeply, survived loss, and chose happiness whenever they could. They built families and communities and lives that mattered. They honored her memory by living fully, just as she had honored Zachary and Thomas by doing the same. In the end, that was what mattered. Not the grief, though it was real and valid. Not the loss, though it left permanent marks. But the love, the joy, the connections forged and maintained. The life built deliberately and carefully from the ruins of what came before. The choice, made again and again, to keep living, to keep loving, to keep hoping. Zelda had made that choice, and it had made all the difference.